Today's daf is daf memtes. The Ema, the Gemara raises the following suffix. We said that once the father sends his daughter, who's a katana or a nara, with the shluchei habal, at that point she becomes a nesua. What happens if she decides to go back to her father's house? Ema hechad hadra lebei nasa, hadra lemilsa kamaisa. We would suggest that if she goes back to the father's house, she makes it about face, heads back to her father's house. She never actually made it into the house of her husband. Therefore, Hajra Milsa Kamaisa, we can reverse the situation and go back to what it was from the get-go, and she's still an Arusa. And the difference would be if Chas V'Shalom she had Znus, then she gets skilo like an Ara Murasa, not chenek like an Isua. So the Gemara is asking the question whether or not Mosar Ha'av L'Shluchei Habal is a reversible situation or is it engraved in stone? And this seems to indicate that, at least according to the Havamina of the Gemara, Mosar Ha'av L'Shluchei Habal is not a full-fledged Nisuin. It's kinesua. She may have certain dinim of nesuin. Yesterday we had a long discussion about this. Shmuel says it only has to do with the Yerusha of the Nedunya. The other Amoraim seem to take it to the other extreme, that it's a full-fledged nesua. But I would say that even if it's a full-fledged nesua, it's not a kinyan nesuin. Perhaps nesuin has different dimensions to it. It's an isur, and it's mata the isur arusa l'baila. On the other hand, it's a kinyan, and now the Baal is konaha for Yerusha, for Maisiyah Deha, he's chayv mizonos, and he's made for Nidarim. All these are expressions and reflections of the kinyan aspect of the Suin, which in the case of Mosar Av L'Shluchei Habal is not a complete Nesuin. She hasn't yet actually entered into the Rishus of the Baal. And Hajra L'Milsa Kamaisa, if she decides to go back, then she reverses the situation. Omar Rava, Hahu Kvar Piska. This question that you vacillate about already has an answer. And that's Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel. The Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel. And now we're going to learn the parsha of Hafaras Nedar. V'neder almana ugrusha kol asher asar al nafsha yakum oleha. Normally, a nara, when she takes a neder, that neder is subject to hafaras nedarim, either on the part of her father, or if after erisin, we need also the hafara of the arus. But here's a situation where she's an almana, she's a grusha, her husband is certainly out of the ballpark, out of the picture. He cannot possibly be made for the nedarim. Either he's not alive anymore, or even if he's alive, he's already delivered a get. And therefore, the Torah is telling me that the father, on the one hand, is out of the picture because he already married off his daughter. She left his rishus. On the other hand, she's not in the rishus of her husband because he already delivered a get or he died. And therefore, there's an automatic kiyum to haneder, because it doesn't lend itself to hafara, neither on behalf of the father nor on the part of the Baal. So the Tana Debei Rabbi Shmuel asks the obvious question: Ma Talmud Lomar? What is the chiddush here in this verse? What was the need for the Torah to tell me that there's no one to be made for Hanedarim? Logically, I can derive that conclusion. Alo mutais michlala av. He has left the rishus of her father after he married her off. Umutais michal baal, and she's no longer in the rishus of the baal because she's an almana or a grusha. So, what was the Torah coming to Mechadech when it says that neder almana grusha kol asher asar al nafsha yakum oleh? Ella, but we get to this middle stage. So now she's on the way towards her husband's Rishus, but she hasn't arrived there yet. There's only been a Mesiras Ha'al. And now it's Armel B'derech Nitzkarish. During this long journey, her husband died or delivered again. Heichani Koreba. Which Rishus is she in? To whose domain does she belong? Is it Beis Avia Shalzu? Does she belong to the domain of her father, and therefore he would be Mefer Hanadarm, or Beis Baila Shalzu? Or she's already left the Rishus of the father. The husband, as we said, is either dead or delivered again, so he's out of the picture. Here's where the pasuk is being mechadish that came into Yotze Sha'achas Mitzvus Ha'al, and with the Mesira to the Tzlukei Abal, she leaves the domain of her father for Sha'achas. Now she decides she wants to go back to her father's Rishus. Shuveni Yachal Lahafer. The father has already forfeited, so to speak. He's lost his right to be Mefer Nidarim. And once those rights were lost, she's out of the Rishus of her father. She doesn't go back to the Rishus of the father. And the Gemara wants to make the following analogy. This is Rava's Chiddush, that in the case of Zinsa, and you want to know whether or not she's still a Nara Rasa, she gets skila in the event of Znus, or she's already out of the situation of Nara Rasa, she's already like an Asua, and therefore her Misa would be a Misas Chenek. The answer is, she'll be Chayeves Chenek, even though she now decides to go back to Beit Avia. Because we don't apply the principle of Kevan the Hadra Lemilsa Kamaisa Kahadra, but rather it's an irreversible situation. Okay, now we get back to the Brisa that we studied yesterday in the previous Amud on Daf Mem Chesam Beis. And we said over there that once the father was Moser, his daughter to Shluchei Abal, her Misa now, an event of Znus, would be Chenek and not Skila, because she's out of the Rishus of her father. Omar of Papa. Afanan Nami Tnina. I want to prove this halacha from the Mishnah that we studied. Habal Nara Hamurasa, Eno Chayev Ajete Nara Besula Morasa Vehibe Beis Avia. The subject of this Mishnah is the Chiyav Skila in the case of an Nara Morasa Shazinsa. And the Mishnah is limiting it in saying that she'll only be Chayev Skila if she's A, a Nara, B, a Besula, 3, Me'orasa, C, Morasa, and D, Vehi Bebeis Avia. And the Gemara is going to now question, what does it mean, Vehi Bebeis Avia? Those three words seem to be out of place. They're inappropriate. They're absolutely superfluous. Why? Because especially in a Nara, I understand why you stipulate that she's got to be a Nara. V'lo Bogeres. Once she's Bogeres, she gets Chenek and Atskila. Besula, V'lo Be'ula. If she's a Be'ula, she gets Chenek and Atskila. Ma'urasa, V'lo Nesua. Once she's a Nesua, she goes out of the category of a Chiyav Skila, and she gets Chenek. But now you added a fourth stipulation, the Beis Avia, that she's only going to be condemned for the death of Skila because she's with Beis Avia. What did you add over here that we don't know? We already excluded a Bogeres. We already excluded a Be'ula. We already excluded a Nesua. So what are you left with? And the answer is Lav Lebe'ute Masara Av L'Shlichabal. That immediately when the father sends his daughter out with the Shluchei Abal, she already has a din of an Nesua, and therefore her Misa will become a Misa of Chenek, and it's no longer a Misa of Skila. And that's an additional category beyond Nesua. Nesua means she entered into the Chuppah, and then she's already literally in the Beis Habal, in the Rishus Habal. So therefore, naturally, she has a din in the case of Znus, of Misas Chenek. But there's another kind of Nesua, which is not a real, in Mitzias, it's not the real Nesuin, because she didn't go into his Rishus, there was no Chuppah, but it was Mosar Av l'shluchei Baal, and that's enough to create a din of Nesua, such that now Hamisa will be Chenek. I also want to bring an additional proof to this conclusion. And the Mishnah says, Abal H's each, came in Shenichnas al Rishus Habal in Nesu, and Afal Pichlo Nivola, Ba, Oleh Reza Bechenek. Now we have a Mishnah that says the following: if a married woman has this immoral relationship, then even though the Baal did not get a chance to consummate the marriage with Be'ila, but nevertheless she entered into his rituals, meaning there was chuppah, he's already nesua, and pakala din misas skila, v'chalolea din misas chenek. So let's be medayik in the Mishnah, says Rav Nachman. Nichnas al rishus habal bi alma. It doesn't say that she went into his chuppah. It says she went into his rishus. What does that mean, a rishus without a chuppah? It must be a case of masara av l'shluchei habal, and yet her misa is now transferred from skila over to chenek because she's like an isua once the av was moser her to the shluchei habal shmamina, and that's the okay. All that we did until now is what I'd call a hashlama to complete the sugya that we started yesterday, and now we start a fresh sugya with the Mishnah. So we're up to the Mishnah here in the middle of Daf Memtes Amud Aleph. Now, we're really, in truth, this Mishnah here on Memtes should be connected to a later Mishnah on Daf Nun Beis. And it has to do with the following. When a man writes a ksuba at the time that he marries a woman, that ksuba has in it a, how do you say in English, a seif, a paragraph, we'll call it, regarding the children from this marriage. And in the ksuba, the husband commits himself to allow the daughters who are born from this marriage, not yet, obviously, this is the time of the Nesua, the ksuba, will be able to support themselves and sustain themselves and get mizonos from the estate. Now, why do I say the estate? Because as we'll soon see in the Mishnah, as long as he is alive, the father is alive, he does not have an obligation to support his children. Sounds a little shocking, but that's the law. However, after his death, the ksuba itself generates a chiyuv on the estate to provide support for his children, and specifically for his daughters. So let's go through the Mishnah. Ha'av eino chayav b'mizonos bito. A father is not obligated to support his daughter. That's on a doraisa level. But Zeh Midrash Dorish Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Lefnei Chacham b'Karmi Yavne, there was a takana that was transmitted to us through Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah in the name of the Chachamim of Kerem B'Yavne, and that is that Habonim Yirshu Vabonos Nizon. The Rabbanan made a takanas bezdin that a person through the ksuba is obligated to guarantee the support and the sustenance of his children that will be born from the marriage. Yirshu, through the kesef ksuba, they will inherit their rights to the estate for support. So imagine the following scenario. Let's say a man dies and he leaves relatives who will inherit his estate. There's got to be a portion, a segment of that estate that is earmarked to support his children. And that's by virtue of the Takanas Chachamim of Ksuba. Now, here's where the takana differentiates between male children and female children. The male children are the heirs, the Yarshim, and they inherit the estate of their father. However, the female children, the Banos, by virtue of this takana that we learn about through Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, they are supported from the estate. So that's called Banim Yiroshu, Banos Yizon. And now the Mishnah explains the equation between the two. There's a certain lowest common denominator between the Banim and the Banos. And what is that? That this entire process by which the estate will be divvied up amongst the Yarshim in the case of the Banim and Mizonos in the case of the Banos, that's all after his death. The rights of the children to inherit their father obviously come after the death of their father. Is afabanos, eno nizonos eliachar misasavia. As long as the father is alive, he's not obligated to support and sustain his children. After his death, by virtue of the ksuba, this takana that we're seeing from Keren B'Yavneh, there is a designation within the estate that the banim, although they inherit the estate, they cannot rebuff the banos. The banos will have rights to collect the mizonos from the estate. So let's say the estate is $10 million. The boys, by virtue of the laws of Yerusha and Parshas Matos, they will inherit the entire $10 million. However, the banos, let's say it takes $10,000 per year, to support them. So they will get that $10,000 a year allowance from the estate. And the banim will have no rights to say, well, we don't want to give you from our Yerusha. But again, all this is after the father's death. But during his lifetime, he's not chayav neither to support his banim nor to support his banos. And now the Gemara is going to focus on the following opening line in the Mishnah of Eino Chayav b'mizonos bito. And there are two implications, or you want to call them inferences, from that language of the Mishnah. Number one, there's no chiyuv on the father to provide mizonos for his bas during his lifetime, but there's a mitzvah to do so. It's not something that we can force him and compel him to do. It's not an absolute unconditional chiyuv, but mitzvah. The second diuk is to contrast banos with banim. In the case of banos, there's no chiyuv on the father to support his daughters. But in the case of banos, during his lifetime, he will be obligated to support his banim. And the question is going to be obvious. Why is there a preferential treatment offered to the banim as opposed to the banos? So the Gemara says the following. On the language of the Mishnah, ha'av eino chayiv b'mizonos bito, b'mizonos bito hu de'eino chayiv, or b'mizonos b'no chayiv. We'll see why in a minute. Furthermore, second diuk, bito nami chovo hu d'leko mitzvah ika. The Mishnah is emphasizing that eino chayiv b'mizonos ishto, implying that he is commanded with a kiyum mitzvah if he'll do the right thing and he'll support his daughters. And now we go into a whole long discussion about various tanoim and how they can or cannot square with our Mishnah. Mani masnisin, to whom can we attribute our Mishnah? Lo k'Rabbi Meir, lo k'Rabbi Yehuda, lo k'Rabbi Yochanan Bro, the son. Now we're going to go through a brisa, and the brisa is going to record three different shitos in the Tanoim, and the Gemara is going to claim that none of them could fit in with the two diyukim. Again, let's go over the two diyukim that we made in the Mishnah. Number one, banim chayav, and number two, banos mitzvah. The Sanya we learned in the brisa mitzvah. Now we're starting with Rabbi Meir. Mitzvah lazun es habanos. Now, that could square very well with our Mishnah, because Rabbi Meir is talking about a mitzvah, not a chova. We cannot compel him and force him, but he's encouraged to do so on a voluntary basis. But the problem is that Rabbi Meir says, Kal v'chomer lebanim. Then how much more so, says Rabbi Meir, is there a mitzvah to support your banim? The aske b'Torah. Now we see that secret element that was missing in our understanding. Why did the banim get a preferential treatment? Because the father wants to support the Torah study of his son. Reminds me of a whole sugi Masechet Kedushin. If, let's say, there's only enough money to pay tuition for the father himself or for the son, who gets the first dibs to go to yeshiva? And the Gemara says there, it depends on who's sharper and who remembers the Torah more. Whole sugi there. I think it's on Chavpes or wherever it is there in Kiddush. So as far as the father's relationship to his sons, his male sons, in terms of support, Rabbi Meir holds it's only a mitzvah. Whereas we were medayik from our Mishnah, that in the case of the sons, it's a chova. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, mitzvah lozun esabonim, kal v'chomer lebanos. Rabbi Yehuda has the exact opposite approach of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, how much more so do we impose some sort of an obligation, a quasi-obligation, called a mitzvah, to support the banim because they're oskim b'Torah? That's even more important than supporting the girls. And Rabbi Yehuda says just the opposite is true. It's much more important to support the girls. Why? Mishum zilusa, because the ein darkam shel isha lechazer al psochim. She has to run around trying to get money and pay in order to support herself. That's a busha. That's a gnai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broko omer chova wasn't sabonos liachar misa saviem aval b'chai aviem elu v'elu enam nizonim. Let's emphasize those two words, enam nizonim. Enam nizonim means there's nothing, not a chova for sure, not even a mitzvah. And now the Gemara analyzes our Mishnah in the light of these three shitas and eliminates all three shitas. Mani masnisim. Rabbi Meir, if you try to suggest that our Mishnah is authored by Rabbi Meir, ha'amar banim mitzvah. Rabbi Meir says explicitly, and it's based on this kal v'chomer, that as far as his relationship to his sons during his lifetime, the father is mitzvah, not a chova. And we were medayik in our Mishnah that mizonos bito is not a chova, but mizonos bino is a chova. That's against Rabbi Meir. I mean to say, Rabbi Meir could not possibly be reconciled with that Mishnah because according to our Mishnah, there's a chova on the father to support his male sons. And Rabbi Meir holds, no, it's only a mitzvah, it's not a chova. Rabbi Yehuda, we cannot attribute our Mishnah to Rabbi Yehuda. Ha'omar, Rabbi Yehuda says, bonim nami, mitzvah. Right? Rabbi Yehuda has a kal v'chomer in the opposite direction. If there's a mitzvah vis-a-vis the banim to support the banim during their lifetime, and how much more so kal v'chomer the banos where there's an issue of shalot tisbazeh. But in any event, there's no chova, and our Mishnah implies that there is a chova, at least in the case of banim. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, again, it's impossible to reconcile that Mishnah with Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Afilu mitzvah nami leka. We understood from Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka in the two words enam nizonim that there's no mitzvah to support them. Very strange halacha that there's no mitzvah whatsoever to support your children. It's pretty radical. We'll see about the Orvim later, about the ravens. So now the Gemara is going to try and attempt to reconcile a Mishnah which each one of these three Tanoim. Ibai Sema, Rabbi Meir. Ibai Sema, Rabbi Yehudi. Iboy same Rabbi Yochanan Broki. Let's go through it one by one. Iboy same, if you like, it's Rabbi Meir. And we can reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Meir. But just we have to change our diuk in the Mishnah. And that is Hachikama of Eino Chayav b'Mizonos Bito, Behu Adin Libno. Not the way we medayik it, that in the case of a ben, the father is obligated to support his son because of Esak HaTorah, but rather there's no chiyuv mizonos, neither vis-a-vis the bonos nor vis-a-vis the bonnet. So again, even though the words hu adid libno are not written in the Mishnah, we're going to read it and interpret it as if those words were in the Mishnah. But what does it say in the Mishnah? It says, "Ha'avenu chayavim zonos bito." A mitzvah bito ika. Right? The Torah, the Mishnah only excludes a chiyuv, implying that there is a mitzvah. And now we can activate Rabbi Meir's Kal V'chomer, that the banim have the extra mila of Esek HaTorah. How much more so will there be a mitzvah vis-a-vis the banim? So the Mishnah never meant to imply that as far as the banim is concerned, there's a chova, and it remains a mitzvah, and that could be reconciled with Rabbi Meir. So now you'll ask the question, so why does it emphasize bito? After all, we're flattening it out, right? We're equating it. Both ben and bito no chova, both ben and bito mitzvah. So why do you mention bito, which would imply that although there's no chiyuv vis-a-vis bas, there is a chiyuv vis-a-vis ben? And the Gemara answers, hakamash malon. And here we're going to turn to Daf Mem Tesam Beis. The afilu bito, even in the case of bas, where there's a lower echelon or lower ebb obligation to support the bas, she's not osekes b'Torah. The whole thrust of the Mishnah is to be machadesh that vis-a-vis the bas, don't think you're off the hook entirely, even though her situation is kal kuf lamed vis-a-vis the ben, but nevertheless, there's no chova, but there's a mitzvah. If there's a mitzvah vis-a-vis the bas, then we activate the kal v'chomer of the mayor. How much more so? There's a mitzvah vis-a-vis the banim, the male children who have the additional dimension of Esek HaTorah.